session, fighting those Austrians in places like the eastern half of France, at the base of the French Alps, where you have territory just as treacherous as this, with mountains, hills, lakes, valleys, forests, streams, rivers, just as you have here today. And on top of that, a lot of these soldiers are very experienced veterans from this war. Now, what they are concerned about is not their experience or fighting in situations such as this, but rather the climate that they find themselves in when they get to places like New France. They're coming originally from the Languedoc province, which is in the south of France, right next to the Mediterranean, where it's warm, balmy temperatures all year round. A whole nothing like you see up here. Places like Quebec, Montreal, even here as far south as Carillon, you can have really nasty weather really quickly. So when they're here, they're issued additions to their uniform, adaptations. You could see them wearing things like toque or wool red knit caps to keep their heads warm. Things like capot or big woolen overcoats to keep their bodies warm. Things like mitas or mitasson or Native American style leggings or Indian leggings are even issued out. Even things like souliers sauvages or moccasins or even souliers de boeuf, about a halfway point between a moccasin and a shoe. Now, there are some things, however, regardless of wherever they go, that are never really going to change. One of them is going to be called the ceinturon, or the waist belt. You'll see around the waist of the soldiers things like housing on the left-hand side, the pay, or the swords, really just for decoration at this point, serving really little practical use, and also things like the bayonet, or the socket bayonet, on the left side of their belt as well. They can affix to the muzzle of their weapon, turning it into a spear. Even this, however, is a little bit modified, especially when people like Baron Dieskau go south. Some cases, they'll take these épées, these swords that really are kind of useless, just for decoration. They'll leave them in storehouses in some cases, leaving them behind, replacing them with much more practical things like hatchets. And some of the times, they'll even get an order to porter le ceinturon au baudier, or take it, instead of wearing it on your waist, sling it over your shoulder like a baldric, so it's a little bit easier to carry. Another thing that never changes is on the right-hand side of their body, called the cartouche, or porte-cartouche, or specifically the giberne, or this cartridge box holding 30 rounds of ammunition behind nice red Russian leather to keep it safe and out of harm's way. That never changes. And the thing that also never changes, most importantly, that directly couples with this giberne, is what they call a fusil, or a musket. And these, all four of them, are 1728 model French infantry muskets. Now what that means is not that they were all made in 1728 in one single batch, but instead, in that year, King Louis XV himself is going to approve of a blueprint, a design from the Royal Ordnance, or Ordnance d'Or. He's going to say, yes, I want this blueprint to be manufactured in all of those major arms manufacturers. Places like Saint-Étienne, Charleville, and Marburg are going to be producing these weapons based on that 1728 model by the tens of thousands. And it is a very good model. It has very modern conveniences when it comes out. Things like an iron ramrod, very convenient for military service. Things like grenadier, are these iron barrel bands that span the length of the weapon. You can pop them off, you can get to the underside of the barrel to clean the weapon even more thoroughly. Things like it's a very long weapon, but it's very light, and it's also very well balanced. A testament of how well it works, that this pattern is used for well over almost 50 years. Very well liked by the French soldiers who use it, even used when opportunity arises by the opposite forces, those troupes légères, chasseurs, the marksmen or light infantry, or rangers in the British Army. Sometimes they'll pick these up and use them for themselves. Now, fortunately for us, these weapons, just like any other firelock of the period, is going to have three major parts. The first part is called the canon, or the barrel, this large 46-inch smooth-bore iron tube that makes up the core of the weapon. The second part, la crosse, or the stock, all of the woodwork that holds everything together. And the most important part is the third one, la plantine, or the lock. It's going to be on the right-hand side of the breech, and it has all those working parts that lets these weapons fire. Now, on the plantine, you have a couple different parts. On the back of the plantine, you have the French call the chien fusil, or the dog of the gun. And in the chien fusil, you have what the French call the pierre fusil, or the stone of the gun. Any guesses what stone of the gun is in English? Flint, right? And a flint is just simply a rock, but it has a couple great properties. You take a flint, strike it at a specific angle known as napping. Due to the composition of this stone, it shears off very cleanly, leaving a very sharp edge. And the second, much more important property of this is that you take that flint, you scrape it against certain very hard metals. One of them working very well is steel, conveniently located on the second part of the lock, called the batterie. This L-shaped piece of iron under tension as well with a face of welded-on steel. So what that means is when you bring that chien de fusil back to the full cock, meaning that the tension of the spring is resting on the release of a trigger, or the détente, above the sous guard, or the trigger guard, so it doesn't go off by accident. When you pull that détente, the chien de fusil flies forward, scrapes against that steel so sharp and so forcefully, it shaves off very tiny filings of steel, red hot. Because of this, we know them commonly as sparks. Now these sparks are going to land in the final piece of the plantine. It's called the bassinet, or the pan. It's this spoon-shaped iron divot on the right-hand side of the log. And inside here, you'd have a priming charge of gunpowder. Now, a shower of sparks lands on a priming charge of gunpowder. It ignites. It rapidly combusts, goes into a tiny hole on the right-hand side of the weapon called the vent, or the touch hole. Those flames go into the breech where your main charge is. It ignites, and just like that, the weapon fires. Now, in the past century, with the last king, King Louis XIV, that great Sun King, when these weapons first come out, originally you could have seen French soldiers, instead of loading it like today, you could have seen them taking out, to load this weapon, things like a powder horn, or a pouveron, or a corn, and having to use that horn to pour a priming charge of gunpowder into the pan. You'd have to see them taking out another set amount of powder, measuring that out, putting that into the muzzle. They'd have to take out wadding or patching, put that into the muzzle. They'd have to reach into a separate compartment, take out their shot, put that into the muzzle. They'd have to take out even more wadding so it doesn't go anywhere, and put that in the muzzle, and then they'd finally have to take out a ramrod to ram it all the way from the muzzle to the breech. Now, as that past century progresses, they realize this is not the best way to load one of these weapons. So what has been around for quite some time, by the very modern age of 1756, is what these soldiers are going to be using to load these weapons. House in that Giberne, called a cartouche, or cartridge. Now, a cartouche is simply just a hollowed out piece of paper. On the inside, loosely grained gunpowder. And at the base, you'd have your projectile, usually just a solid lead ball fitted to the bore of the weight, or the gauge of the weapon. Now, this is a streamlined way of loading this weapon. You can do it much, much faster when using things like cartridges. And I'm sure, at this point in your lives, you've all seen a ton of war movies. And they always do this very dramatically in Hollywood. So you tell me, what is the very first step in loading this weapon with a cartridge? Besides holding it like this. Any ideas?
Bite the end off.
Yeah, bite the end off, right? Biting it off very dramatically, exposing that gunpowder, pouring it into the pan, shutting the pan, casting the weapon about, taking that open cartridge, flipping it, putting it into the muzzle, powder, ball, and wadding all together, taking out what the French call a baguette, not to be confused with a piece of bread, but simply the word for an iron rod or stick, and using it to bring it from the muzzle to the breech of the weapon. And as soon as you've done that, this weapon is loaded and ready to fire. And a trained professional soldier is expected to do this at once every 10 to 15 seconds. If you do the math, it's about 4 to 6 shots every minute with these weapons, which is pretty darn fast. And what you see in front of you are 4 very well trained, very professional, strikingly handsome soldiers of the Long Duck Regiment. But are we that imposing, just standing as we are, maybe facing an enemy in a field? No, shake your heads now, it's okay, we can take it. Now, what could be more imposing than just the 4 of us standing right here? Right, more. You could have a lot more soldiers. Now imagine even more soldiers, hundreds of them standing out in the same field, but they're still milling about and acting as individuals. Are they even imposing? No, right? And this is a problem that is not new to the period. It has been around since the dawn of warfare itself. How do you take soldiers and put them together so they work as a unit and turn into an imposing force? Now, this question has been around forever, and you can look back thousands of years to people like Julius Caesar, that famous Roman general with all his Roman legionnaires, going through places like Gaul in a campaign, taking these men and these legionnaires and trying to civilize Gaul. Would you see those ancient Roman legionnaires standing in a field milling about however they want? No, right? They are falling into what they're named after, a legion, 1,000 men, shoulder to shoulder, half arms distance apart, working together as a unit, stabbing at the same time with those gladius swords, covering each other at the same time with those shields, and by doing this, working together as one united machine instead of individuals, they are able to civilize places like Gaul and defeat those very brave, but unfortunately, individualistic thinking Gauls. Now, this way of fighting as big units or teams of soldiers, has progressed through the centuries and centuries of use, and as technology advances, you can even see it approaching into the gunpowder age. And as the gunpowder age dawns in the past century, you see this same system working because it works so well. Originally, these weapons really first come out, you could have seen 30 ranks deep by 30 files wide, this huge square. As technology improves throughout the century, eventually they trim it down to maybe 16 ranks deep of men. And by the very modern age of 1756, you could have seen maybe 8 ranks deep. If you want a big column of French soldiers to push through a defensive work, you could see maybe 4 ranks deep if you want a group of soldiers to hold one spot very effectively. And at the bare minimum, you could see 3 ranks of men, 3 ranks deep. What you see is one file of 3 ranks, each one of these soldiers being about a half arm's distance apart. And the files, dozens of them to the left and the right, being about a light elbow's contact away. Now, when we're standing in this compact group of soldiers, hundreds of us, we can't naturally load whenever and however we want. There's going to be a lot of problems if we do that, especially using loaded weapons. It's very dangerous. So to solve this problem, the French army doing it, other armies all over the world, is they're looking at, for the French, those royal ordinances. Of those ordinances de law, they're looking at manuals, treatises, exercises, picturing almost a big instruction book to teach these soldiers every step of how to load this weapon, how exactly to hold that weapon when you're doing it, and the cadence or speed to do it at, or counting out, a rhythmic beat, or 1, 2, or 1, 2. So when these soldiers are doing it, they're doing everything at the same exact time in the same fashion. So they're not bumping into each other. They're very safe, and when they're very well trained, they all click together like one huge machine. Now, when these soldiers were ready to load their weapons, maybe they're doing it by the numbers. The first order you would hear would be to, bring the weapon to the front of their body. Bring the weapon to their chest, opening that batterie, taking out one of those cartouches from the chaban, holding it next to their side. Ripping it open with their teeth, exposing that gunpowder. Pouring that priming charge of gunpowder into the pan of the weapon. Shutting that pan. Bring the weapon to their sword side, to the left-hand side of their body, so that exposed cartridge is right next to the muzzle. Mettez la cartouche dans le canon. Putting it right down the muzzle of the weapon. Tirez la baguette. They're taking out that ramrod, shortening it against their waist belt for ease of use. Bourrez. Ramming it all the way down to the muzzle to the breech in one swift motion. As soon as they've done that, shortening it again for ease of use. Mettez la baguette en son lieu. Putting it right back into the pipes of the weapon. And as soon as they've done that, these weapons are loaded and ready to fire. Portez, fusil. Now, when these weapons are loaded, these soldiers are not just going to fire whenever they want. Just as with the loading procedure, the firing procedure is broken down to a step-by-step process, being the much more dangerous part of the whole deal. And that French officer who's in charge is going to wait for the opportunistic time to fire these weapons. Maybe it's in the last war. They're in the French Alps, and they have Austrian dragoons riding up upon them, less than 100 yards away, quickly approaching the ideal time to give fire. Up, the fusil. Bring the weapon to the full cock. The front rank man, he takes a step down, or knee down, so he's out of the way of the other 2 ranks. The middle ranks, they take a step back for balance, and the rear ranks, they take a step to the right, to the side, so they can shoot through the gaps in the files. On shoot! Each one of these soldiers taking aim down range, taking careful aim, being able to hit a man-sized target upward to about 100 yards, waiting quietly and patiently for that final order to give fire. Up. Weapons go off, and they immediately bring them right back to their chest, so they're ready to do the whole thing over again if need be. Mettez le chiot, le sort un peu. Remez, le bassinet. Ôtez, le fusil. And this works great if you have a French army of 10,000 men, or even 100,000 men in the great fields of Europe. It works great in North America when the situation arises. But when these soldiers are here at Carillon on the peninsula, as early as the fall of 1755, they have one thing that can work to their advantage. Any ideas? Yeah.
Over the mountain?
Well, they have mountains all over the place, but they built something. I'll give you a hint. There's a large stone one right behind you. No, a fort, or even just a wall. As easy as a wall. Maybe a 6-foot high, what they call parapet. Now picture a 6-foot high earthen and log wall. And between that fill packed together, but it's 6 feet high, which means you can't really see over. So what the French do, when they're fighting behind these fortifications, they put what's called a banquette, or a fire platform, about 1.5 feet off the ground, so they can step on up, and they can easily just fire over this wall. Now, when they're behind fortifications such as this, they're not going to fight in that fire system, because if you do that, you have to wait maybe 10 or 15 seconds between 5 shots going down range. And a well-trained enemy will simply just wait for you to expend all of your weapons and then rush your wall and take your defensive works. So when they're behind these walls, they're well versed in how to fight behind defensive fortifications. One of the things they're trained behind to do is called parapet firing. So what they'll do is they'll take those ranks and files, they'll have the front rank soldier step on up to that firing platform, he'll fire his weapon, and then as soon as he's done firing, he'll run to the back of the file and he'll reload his weapon. The soldier behind him steps on up to that firing platform, fires, goes back to the end of the file, reloads, and so on and so forth. So you have a rolling fire, a constant fire. It's a very efficient fire, especially when you're working behind a defensive work. But is it all that effective? That is a great question that Maurice de Saxe asks, a very famous French general of the time. And he finds that it isn't really that effective for a couple reasons. Firstly, when that front rank man takes a step up on that firing platform to shoot his gun, he only has a couple seconds to do so, which means he's rushed. He doesn't have a lot of time to take a well-placed, accurate shot. So that's a problem. And the second problem that he finds is within the ranks of files of soldiers, not all of them are equally as good shots. You have soldiers who get a little nervous, they're impatient because they're rushed, and they don't make a well-aimed, accurate shot. You have soldiers who are just plain awful at firing weapons. They couldn't shoot a broadside of a barn. You have some soldiers who are very good at shooting weapons, but they're rushed because they have these men in the files behind them. So even they can't take a very well-placed shot. And this problem is going to make it not very effective fire. So one of the ways that they solve this is they go into those ranks and files. They condense them down, 2 files turning into 1 file, 6 to 8 men. And out of that file, they're going to pick a marksman, what the French call chasseur, or the best shot of that file. And they're going to put him right on up on that banquette, or that firing platform, so he's the only guy seeing over the wall. So, out of the 3 soldiers behind me, which one of them do you think is the best shot? We can't continue till you pick.
The last
First
one.
The musicians pulled from the ranks.
The last one.
The second.
The middle one? Well, turns out the middle one is indeed our best shot. He can shoot the wings of a falcon at 200 yards, much to the groaning of the DEC and the EPA. Now, that marksman, as soon as he's selected from the file, he's going to take a position or a post right on top of that firing platform, so he can see right over that wall. Now, he's just going to stay put. Now, what can the men behind him do to help him out? Load weapons, right? I was going to say moral support, but that works much better. So they can run on in behind him and get on in behind him on a file, they themselves not being on that firing platform, just behind him. So they're going to be loading their weapons. So what will happen is that front rank man, he'll fire a weapon, and instead of going to the back of the files, he'll simply pass an unloaded weapon behind him. It'll be picked up by the soldiers behind him. He'll have a pool of loaded weapons, pass one of those, and reload the one he just expended. And by using this and by moving the guns instead of the people themselves, you get very efficient and also very effective fire. Because that marksman, he's never rushed. He can take very well-aimed, accurate shots. And he only has to worry about shooting. And the soldiers behind him only have to worry about loading, which means they can do this very, very effectively. And it turns out, right before they get on the boat to go to New France in May of 1755, a brand new ordnance law comes out, or those manuals, and it talks about a revised version of parapet firing. So by the time they're here in 1756, they're very well trained in how to do such, which means they'll have to wait for a couple general orders. One they call and each one of these soldiers knows it's time to go about loading his weapon as quickly as he can. And as soon as he's done loading his weapon, he'll pass it up to the front of his body, signaling that he's ready to give fire. Now, as soon as these soldiers in the files, all of them have loaded weapons, you see this, they're ready to give fire. Each one of these files being ready, that front rank man, that chasseur, he's going to have his weapon in the full cock already because he knows he's going to be firing his weapon. So he's already ready and loaded. And the men behind him, as soon as they're all loaded and bringing the weapon up to the front of their body, and then whoever's in charge sees this all down the file, everyone's ready and loaded to give fire. They're going to wait for that order to en shoot. That marksman taking aim on his target. Maybe at this point, there's Connecticut provincials, a New York provincial, about 50 yards away from this parapet wall. They're going to wait still quietly, very well disciplined for that final order. The weapon goes off, and he immediately gets a loaded weapon passed up to the ranks behind him. And as soon as he knows he has a loaded weapon behind him, he can give fire. He can get another loaded weapon passed up behind him in the ranks. And he can do this over and over and over again, always having a loaded weapon so he's never caught off guard. Weapons being passed up from behind him. Now you can see the 4 of us doing this today, but picture 6 or maybe even 8 men doing this, all at the same time working as a team, loading for a marksman up on the wall. And they can do this to great effect, maybe doubling their fire rate. Very efficient and very effective fire by doing this. And the French do this to great effect, especially years later, in 1758, the Battle of Ticonderoga, when you have a small French army being outnumbered for 4 to 1, but because they're doing things like this, the revised version of parapet firing, they put out very effective, very efficient fire all throughout the day. And they can do this over and over and over again so that whoever's in charge gives them that final order to cease fire. With that, each one of these soldiers knows that it's time to stop firing. They have a loaded weapon, they'll discharge it over that parapet and be ready to do whatever comes next. Now, hopefully this gives you an idea of some of the tactics of what these soldiers are doing in places like carrying off, fighting behind defensive works. And this place is pretty important in 1756. There's other French forts up the lake, places like Fort Saint-Frédéric, other posts like Chambly, Saint-Jean, but unfortunately for the French, a lot of these are too old, they're too small, they're just not going to cut it. So it's here that the French army is really going to draw the line in the sand. It's going to take Fort Carillard, and it's going to take the British army a few years and tens of thousands of men to finally push the French out of New France. Now, before I let you go, a lot of things you can see throughout the day. At 11:30, at the base of this American flagpole, you can meet the Fife and Drum Corps, and they will bring you down, musically escorting you to the King's Garden, the Ticonderoga, and there you'll meet a member of the garden staff, and they'll start the Breaking Ground tour, talking about the history of the garden and the lowlands to the east. You also have a choice. At 11:30, you can go into the middle of the fort. You can meet a member of the museum staff, and they will start the Contents Collection Tour, talking about and touring throughout all the exhibits, museums inside the fort. You can go do that. At 1:15, there's the second tour of the day. If you missed the first one, at the base of that American flagpole. And if you really like these weapons, after we safely cleared all of them, we'll be sticking around to answer any questions, and you can even look at the weapons if you want. So on behalf of myself, the rest of the staff here, thank you for coming out today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I hope you have a great rest of the day and carry on. So thank you.